Hello students, this is Dr. Gaurangi Bhatt here. Today I am here with a new chapter, Mother's Day by J.B. Priestley, Snapshot Supplementary Reader in English for Class 11th. First of all, I would like to give you the introduction of this play. The play written by J.B. Priestley reveals how a mother's efforts are ignored by her family. It narrates how the family members who work 8-hour shifts a day look upon her, although she works for the whole day and all week. After all she does for them, they take her for granted. They make her feel obligated to provide for them and do not even appreciate her efforts. It revolves around how her friend Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is a fortune teller, helps her earn the place and respect she deserves as the woman of the house. Now we have the different characters in this play. Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is Mrs. Annie Pearson's neighbor. She knows magic and helps Mrs. Annie Pearson to reform the spoiled members of Mrs. Annie Pearson's family. Second, we have Mrs. Annie Pearson. She is pleasant but nervous lady whose excessive love and care has spoiled her 2 children and husband. Next, we have Doris Pearson. She is Mrs. Annie Pearson's daughter of 20 years. She fails to understand her mother's struggle and never helps her mother in household chores. Third, we have Cyril Pearson. He is Mrs. Annie Pearson's son, who is equally demanding and never sympathizes with his mother. Last, we have Mr. George Pearson. He is Mrs. Annie Pearson's proud husband, who is not as respected in society as expected. He dominates his wife. Now we have the summary of this play. First, we have Mrs. Annie Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Annie Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald are next door neighbors. Annie, a nervous looking lady of 40, Fitzgerald is older but with strong personality. She is a fortune teller. She reads Annie's fortune. She advises Annie to be strict and become the boss in her family, as Annie is not treated well by her family. Next, we have Mrs. Fitzgerald's plans to reform Annie's family. So we see that Mrs. Fitzgerald suggests Annie to temporarily exchange their personality by using a magic spell that she had learned in the East. She spells some magic words and suddenly a transformation takes place and the personality of Mrs. Fitzgerald shifts into the body of Annie and vice versa. So this way they interchange their personalities. Mrs. Fitzgerald, now in the body of Annie, stays at Annie's house and sends Annie to her house where she can relax. Next is both siblings get a shock. When Doris and Cyril enter, they both get the shock at seeing her mother smoking and playing cards alone. When Doris asks about her dress, she doesn't respond. Same way, when Cyril asks for tea, she says that she wanted a change, that is why she has not bothered to make tea. Further, he asks about his dress. She says no. Next, we have argument between mother and daughter. When Annie sarcastically remarks about Doris' dress, she becomes angry and blames her mother that because of her she looks awful. Then Annie inquires if any strong beer was left. Cyril becomes shocked that his mother wants to drink it. He is unable to understand what is going on. Next, we see that discussion between Doris and Cyril. They both are siblings, brother and sister. Both the siblings are filled with terror and are shocked at their mother's strange behavior. They both are hurt her. Both start giggling at the thought of what will happen if their mother keeps on behaving in this weird manner in front of their father. Next, Annie's remarks about her own family. Annie tells that it was high time they grew up. She even tells it is her children's and husband's behavior that troubled her a lot. She always does her best to keep them happy, but they were not bothered about her. Moreover, she says that she will also going to take 2 days off from work. She is fed up of staying in the house for years and wants to go out. Next, we see that Mr. George Pearson gets shocked at Annie's behavior. Annie's husband, Mr. George, gets shocked as he enters the house. he gets annoyed with Annie, who is sipping beer. He tells her that he has to go to clubs, so he does not want any tea. So we see that Annie rebukes him and says people call him Pompey Pearson due to his self-important behavior. The real Annie Pearson returns. Mrs. Fitzgerald, actually Mrs. Annie Pearson, enters and finds Doris in tears. Her family continues to get scolding in front of her also. Mrs. Annie Pearson, actually Mrs. Fitzgerald, informs her that she was putting everyone in their place. When Mr. George Pearson shouts at his wife, she threatens to slap his big, fat, silly face. Both the neighbors go back to their original personalities. Mrs. Annie Pearson tells Mrs. Fitzgerald that is enough, let them change back and get into their true selves. Mrs. Fitzgerald spells some magic words and they come back to their own selves. And then Mrs. Annie says that she did not enjoy this changeover, but Mrs. Fitzgerald wants her not to be soft with her family and she has to be firm. She now manages her family nicely and they talk to each other politely. The play ends with a happy note where the children and husband are willing to do whatever Mrs. Annie Pearson suggests. Hope this